Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Allison Yearwood, and I am beyond honored and pleased to, as my first role as Executive Director of Plugin ICA, to do the land acknowledgement. We are back home, my hometown of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and we are situated on Treaty 1, which is the homeland for Dene, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and its Métis homeland number 1. At this moment, I'd like to bring along onto the live stream Nazrin. Please wait.
The audio?
I'm not getting to see it. Yes, Sam.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Allison, for the land acknowledgement. We're so excited that Allison's here with us as our new executive director. And I'm very excited to also introduce this event and this artist talk by Kandis Friesen. As Allison mentioned, I am Nazrin. I'm the curator here at Plugin Institute of Contemporary Art. We are located on Treaty 1 territory. Treaty 1 was signed in 1871, taking this territory from 7 local Anishinaabe First Nations in order to make the land available for settler use and ownership. Plugin is an institution, and institutions are fraught places historically conditioned by the colonial structures that create them for settler use and ownership. Here at Plugin, we are thinking and feeling through this as we recognize the ways in which art institutions continue to contribute to the settler colonial narrative and embody its politic. As curator working in such an institution, I acknowledge the limitations that I might come up against, and I continue to ask, what are the commitments of Plugin when it comes to decentering settler narratives and knowledge? What changes am I able to implement in my position? What are my responsibilities and priorities as curator? And how are they motivated by the possibilities that open up when structural transformation is at the heart of the work that is to be done and that must be done? The art that I love is one that troubles our understanding of the world, one that shifts our ways of being in order to transform, work that moves us toward accountability, to be accountable to each other and to the promises we make, to put us to task in order to implement change. I hope, and in my capacity to do so, these changes will not be symbolic and are not reduced to superficial modes of inclusivity or diversity, but are concrete and ongoing. This means that as curator, I'll continue to center the work of Indigenous artists, Black artists, artists of color, whose contribution to contemporary art is vast, has a long history, and continues to rock the foundations of colonial and settler provenance. Here at Plugin, we aim to showcase programs and exhibitions that not only challenge us or encourage us to ask questions differently, but move us toward new connections, collectivities, feelings never felt before, new imaginings of otherworldly existence that give life to possibility within what often seems impossible. So it is with great pleasure and excitement that tonight I introduce Kandis Friesen, working with text between language, image, and object. Kandis will speak on construction and collage, moving along paths of making and thinking that reside on the edges in movements and movement in exiled and exhilarated states, as she told me. Her research and methods emphasize the work of citation. This is a work of constant translation and transposition, where the replica and the copy, the echo and the choir develop as central modes. Such a relay brings together histories not yet written, artworks not yet named, and monuments and memories not yet formed that are resistant to the solid and committed to dispersal. Kandis's work has been exhibited and screened at Lux in London, Hyde Park Art Center in Chicago, the Chicago Architecture Biennial, at Truck Contemporary in Calgary, at the Art Gallery of Hamilton, at FIFA in Montreal, at Windex here in Winnipeg, among many, many more. She has received many grants and awards, including Images Festival, Steam Whistle Award with Nahid Mansour, the Best Canadian Work at Windex, and the Bruce Yabo Art Foundation Travel and Research Grant. Her video works are distributed by Givre in Montreal, where she currently resides. Welcome, Kandis.
Thank you so much, Nazrin and Allison, for your introductions and acknowledgement of land and struggle. I want to begin tonight by talking about this exhibition I have up at Plugin. It's up for another week. It's the image you see in front of you. And sorry about that, I got a notification. This is the end of this exhibition, and the beginning of this exhibition started with the lockdown and the pandemic. And I want to thank everyone at Plugin, especially Nesreen Hamada and Theo Sims, for helping this come into being during such a strange time. I also have to say it's extremely strange to speak without an audience in front of me, and I wish that we were together in person, although this is also a really nice way to be together. This exhibition kind of arrives out of a way of thinking I've been thinking about my work over the past several years, of really thinking through the notion of diasporic site specificity, of thinking about what it might mean. To think about site specificity as dispersal itself, connected dispersal as site, to think about the ways in which ideas, objects, actions, and texts can remain contiguous across expansive realms. I really think about this work in relationship to Nazmin's quite beautiful introduction of talking about what it means to be committed to deconstruction and accountability within this moment and all moments. And I've been thinking through the kind of context I coming from Russian Mennonite culture as a kind of ethno-cultural site of a space, of a conceptual space that I grew up in my hometown of Winnipeg. And thinking about a saying we have in our language, our oral language, which is that our only homeland is our mother tongue. And we arose as a people or as a kind of group or a collectivity out of a radical moment and a radical movement in the 1500s during the Reformation of the Church. And I find that radicality of those early times as a really inspiring kind of way of thinking through collectivity. And we carried our language with us as we migrated, fleeing from persecution and from state violence. And I've been thinking through what it means to carry an oral language, to try to learn an oral language that I didn't grow up with, but that my whole family spoke around me. And thinking about what it means if we might be able to think about a homeland or belonging or collectivity as a site of resonance and dispersal, that we have to constantly construct a homeland through speech or through voice or through singing or through sound, and that when the sound ends, that's when the geography dissipates. What might that mean in terms of thinking through collage and thinking through construction, being committed to a sense of resonance and dispersal as opposed to the solid, as opposed to the solidity that forms through structures of power. I've been thinking also through what art making is and what art making means in terms of being in the world and writing into the world. And as I get to know different practices of people in my family, people that have material practices, this is an inside view of the exhibition on at Plugin right now. As I think through a lot of the different material practices that I learned from, that I apprenticed from before I had an art education and an official means, was really people working in as unofficial artists or non-official capacities, not in traveling in worlds that named things as art or as institution, but having a deep and personal and familial and community relationship to objects, to images, to patterns, to sounds. And as I think about some of the narratives that have been left out of, for instance, when I was growing up in Winnipeg, on that territory, the narratives that were left out of how I thought through my way of being in the world were narratives of my Soviet cousins who were exiled, who we didn't speak about or spoke about very rarely in kind of furtive sentences, maybe out of a bit of a sense of fear but also out of guilt, about my grandparents' experience of exile and how they held silence around that experience as coming as refugees, as part of the colonial framework of migration. And I think also about the mass exile that was happening through the signing of treaties and through mass dispossession and genocidal policy. That meant that I was living among all of these multiple exiles at once, and I did not know the narratives of such stories and what it means when we have access to such narratives. And so on a personal and cultural level, I'm working through some of the constructions of these narratives in this exhibition through writing of my Soviet family and a lot of people in my family who have material practices who I would name as artists, but as such. In this way, I think of this exhibition in many ways as short poems that are together in this space for a short amount of time, for a few months, existing as kind of texts to themselves and then sharing space together. And I think a lot about my work as expanded literature, a kind of experimental writing practice in ways, alongside thinking of the materiality of such writing. This is somewhere between like storytelling and object making and installation, and could maybe be talked about as a kind of folk art. Folk art being an art form that is very self-aware of its lineage before it and continuing and expanding and shifting from that lineage of form. I want to talk about one unofficial artist in my family whose practices have really inspired me, which is my great aunt Loli. She was exiled to Soviet Central Asia in her childhood, ended up in Tajikistan with her mother, and worked in a forced labor camp from the age of 6 to 16. She then carved out a life in the capital and ended up being, her and her mom being the only Russian Mennonites in all of Tajikistan, which she speaks about as both stressful and also quite liberating, which is an interesting, she speaks in a very nuanced ways about her experience of exile because of some of the freedom it gave her once she was not incarcerated anymore. And I visited her for the first time in Darmstadt in South Germany in 2016. And she had the exact same accent as my grandmother, even though they were separated across continents for decades. And she plied me with stories, with photographs, with chai and pelmeni. She was very excited to talk about her life and the difficult things and the amazing things that she experienced in exile. And as I was speaking with her, I started looking around the living room and I noticed that there were paintings hung at very strange kind of staggered heights all around me. And they were paintings of mountains, like maybe kind of crappy paintings of the Alps, maybe other imagined mountainscapes, and that they kind of formed a skyline or a circle around me in really strange heights. And I finally asked her, I said, where did you get these paintings? What are these paintings about? It's not an average way of hanging paintings. Do you really like mountains? And she said she had found them in the garbage and thrift stores, and she had installed them because she missed the skyline of Dushanbe so much. It was a city surrounded by a mountain range. And she had created this doubled kind of image of that mountainscape in her living room, a kind of ghost skyline, but transplanted with Alps and other actual geographies. And I tell this story to kind of introduce my understanding of how I work in my practice, which is often through a kind of doubling and a transposition, a citation, and how I see that actually a lot of women in my extended family, including my grandmother, work through similar means, and starting to kind of wonder if this is maybe something that we've shared with each other, passed on to each other, we've learned from each other. I transposed her mountain range from her postcards that she'd given us, me and my dad, these postcards with stories on the back of them, talking about her life. And I've brought these images of these mountains into different spaces, thinking through wallpaper, through textiles on walls, through the relationship of image to architecture. I think a lot about what Svetlana Boym talks about as inhabitation of exile. She talks not opposing defamiliarization and uprootedness, but embracing it and being constituted by uprootedness. And that when one can inhabit exile, one can then work in construction with doubles and ghosts. And I hadn't read her work until after I started working in this way, and her writing really kind of expands upon what I see in the unofficial art practices of women across my family. Again, thinking through the construction of national narrative here in a Soviet context, almost every single Soviet history book of each separate Soviet, so of each country, so to speak, would always have an image of a birch forest, even if the country or the Soviet didn't have a birch forest. It was this, there was a kind of vision towards constructing a Soviet person, and as opposed to individual culture or language or ethnicity of the place that the Soviet Union had expanded to. Thinking through the birch tree as a very central landscape and tree in Ukraine, and of course also in Manitoba, and thinking again through wallpaper and through textile hanging, and here allowing the paper to also take on the gesture and the form of birch bark itself, as also a kind of disintegrating wallpaper. These kind of architectural citations and image citations kind of echo through my work, through photographs I take one year, maybe make the work a few years later. Here, the ceiling of the school that my grandmother went to in Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine, during the revolution years or after the revolution years. Working with a detail from this photograph I took, from this architecture I visited, and thinking about different spaces that this ceiling kind of image of thinking about her staring up and moving it into other spaces and bring it to the floor. This work actually, my things are stuck in Chicago. I've been away from my studio and all of my belongings, and these will be installed in a forest in collaboration with a gallery I work with called Roman Susan, and they'll be allowed to disintegrate in a location that they choose based on their relationship to this work. Again, thinking through, these are Russian Mennonite ceiling tiles that I saw in Zaporizhzhia region. And as I work through different kind of intuitive sculptural modes, here I'm also thinking about the loom, as I was weaving a lot during this time. And also the image of asbestos form cast roofing sheets, which are made of asbestos mined in Canada and pressed and formed and exported to places like India and Ukraine, because they're extremely durable, but also extremely toxic, and are illegal here actually, but are produced here for other nations. And thinking about that relationship of architecture and form and how we experience architecture. As I enter into different aspects of Soviet history, I've been reading about the Soviet conceptualists that were working in unofficial capacities in the 70s and 80s, the end of the Soviet era, and really inspired by a lot of their work that also really was a form of inhabitation of exile, and also was dealing with a sense of expanded literature, again, drawing on kind of the history of Russian literature, but having to work in unofficial capacities because they were unable or uninterested in working in the official Soviet art forms of socialist realism. In Soviet Union, if you didn't work within socialist realism, you were not an artist. And so these very small groups of artists who are really working on the edges had very small communities in which show work in each other's apartment complexes, in bedrooms. And this particular group, Collective Actions Group, would go to the countryside to perform actions, install works like this one, the series of banners called The Slogan. And this, this banner translates to, "I do not complain about anything, and I almost like it here, although I've never been here before and know nothing of this place." It's an excerpt from Monastyrski's novel, Nothing Happens. And thinking about what it meant for them to be producing art in a context with almost no feedback and almost no audience. One of the artists in this of this era, Ilya Kabakov, speaks about making work within a void and kind of having to trust the void or inhabit the void as a way of kind of surviving through to make this such work. I found this really interesting in terms of thinking through my great aunt's exile, through my cousin's exile in Kazakhstan, and thinking about what it means to continue a practice or to continue a culture that is absolutely unofficial and actually illegal. And in both cases, for the Soviet conceptualists and for my family, the only kind of official audience was actually the KGB, so that you kind of had the state secret police being the only official body that kind of kept tabs on you and kind of was following your work in a way. In my family's context, following whether they were practicing their faith and their culture or not, along with many others, other ethno-cultural religious groups. So thinking about transposing this banner was also an opportunity to think through what it means to write in the Plotich language, which is the Russian Mennonite oral language I spoke about before. I'm learning the language through my art practice, and it means I'm in constant contact with my dad and with my aunt and with other family members to think through translating into an oral language, to slowly understand it and build my knowledge of it, and also to experiment with what it means to write in an oral language, to force an oral language into an alphabet, whether it's the Latin or the Cyrillic, and how that impacts the language, the circulation of the language, and who I'm making this work for. In this case, my cousins are Russian Mennonites who were exiled to Central Asia, are some of the only people who can immediately read such works and such texts. So also thinking about audience and circulation. This is another work, again, a quilted text in the Plotich language. And of course, this is the banner, the cedar and the birch banner that is in the plugin exhibition. Again, a collage text that I wrote in translation from English into Plotich. And with this text and the previous banner, I worked with Heinrich Siemens, who is a Soviet, Latvian, Russian Mennonite Plotich translator. He runs one of the only Plotich publishing companies, I think, in the world, and has dedicated his life really to keeping the language in circulation and negotiating the language with alphabet and with writing, which we've had really interesting conversations about what it means to do that, to push an oral language into writing. I also keep returning to this idea of grafting, which I think is really central to living in a multilingual head or a multilingual community, where translation and adaptation is something that happens constantly. And if you're a diasporic person, you're adapting to material means, to landscape, to relationship with place and materials. And here is an image of an almost 900-year-old oak tree in South Ukraine. If anyone is Russian Mennonite and watching this, they would recognize this as the Hortitsa oak. It is a tree that is not only grafted in people trying to save the tree, mistakenly used concrete for a while during the Soviet era, which is why there's concrete and wire holding this tree together. It's actually drowning on dry land, which is another story, but people from this area that have emigrated, when they come back here, they take acorns from this tree and plant them in other places. So in Winnipeg, there is a Hortitza oak tree near Charleswood, and I'm sure many others. And thinking through what it means to graft through plants and seeds, which can also be a colonial act and can be an act of preserving home, a relationship to home. And also thinking through this kind of notion of the non-ruinous ruin, thinking through structures, architectures, the oak tree as hesitant monuments. Here is the archives building in Odessa, Ukraine. I'm working on a project with the Museum of Modern Art in Odessa on an installation responding to this building. And I don't have time to speak about this work right now, but really thinking through what it means to work with a non-ruinous ruin, that being a structure, or in the instance of the oak tree, a tree, something that is disintegrating. It's becoming a ruin in process, but it's still necessary, it's still valued, and it's still in very active use. So it is not a nostalgic ruin or a new object that is ruined, but it is still the thing itself. And this building is completely falling apart. It holds the official state archives of the Odessa province, and it is actually dangerous to enter into this building every day. Archivists and researchers enter into this building and put their lives at risk to utilize the archives, because there's nowhere else to move the archives to. And this is a whole other kind of story and context of neoliberal post-Soviet Ukraine. But I show this image as to show these beautiful buttresses that were built in the 90s. They're very provisional supports. They're literally the only thing holding up the building, which is quite scary, and pushing the building up. But it's very striking, and this building is very famous in Odessa because people care about the fact that it holds their memory, their collective memory, and that it's at risk. And it's a very clear metaphor for the state of memory in Ukraine. But these structures, in their provisional nature and in their leaning, very much present like constructivist theater sets. They kind of imply that an action or a play or some kind of activity is going to happen within them or around them. And it's very rare to see a building held up with scaffolding in this manner. Really thinking through what these directionalities mean, these angles, the push towards the sky or the future. There's a lot held within such angles that relate to geometries of folk art and traditional patterning. The constructivists were an art movement in the early 20th century that started before the Russian Revolution, but really exploded when the revolution took place, and has influences advertisements and images and design that we see every day. And there's a lot held within the energy and the directionality of constructivist. Here we see a theater set. I was looking a lot at these provisional theater sets, and also the content of some of the radical plays that were being put on during this time for the production of an artist book last year. Here, Tatlin's Tower, which was intended as a monument to the Third International, to worldwide socialism. It never got built, but again, it's an extremely famous paper architecture, model architecture. And thinking through what it means to show the scaffolding and to show the construction, to show that the use of the architecture or the space is about active use. This was a radio transmission tower. This was a place for film screenings. This was a place for meetings and activity. And the resonance of those angles in that image. I mean, even in the Human Rights Museum, I spoke to an architect who worked on the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, which is another subject also, but their reference for that building was a drawing on Tatlin's Tower. And thinking back to the early constructivists and where they were going for their reference and research. The revolution was about creating a new society at a new moment, and throwing off the yokes of the monarchy, the rich and the elite that had been holding the people down. Thinking about, all of a sudden there was an explosion of what is the possibility? What do we want to create? What do we want our liberation to look like? And a lot of constructivists, it's not talked about very frequently, it's not in a lot of art history books, but they spent a lot of time in folk art colonies and working with folk art artists. So artists that were working with traditional patterns and traditional images, studying the angles and the geometries and speaking with them about the kind of meaning and language that, that those patterns held. Here are some constructivist textile patterns from Varvara Stepanova, who's an incredible, incredible artist and designer. Here is just some images of some of the traditional patterns that these such early constructivists would have been looking at. Pizanki, which is an ancient art form in Ukraine, still practiced everywhere in the diaspora. And these patterns are hyper-regional. They would be painted eggs that would be blown out and dyed and decorated, sometimes carved out of wood. And these patterns become like a type of language, like a type of text. They're hyper-regional, as well as blouses, like the vyshivanki, Ukrainian blouse with embroidery on it, the rushnik, which is a regional textile. Like many places in the world, these patterns held local knowledge about medicine, about plants, about history, about stories. And thinking about, again, thinking about folk art, if we can use that term, thinking about these kind of trajectories. And the if we think about oral language, I think about these patterns as a kind of language that was functioning in another form of circulation. I bring your attention to the fourth egg. That is the stylized oak leaf, and inside the 8-pointed star. The third egg also has the 8-pointed star, which is a central geometry and form to a lot of indigenous visual cultures in Turtle Island in Northern Americas. It's central to Palestinian embroidery. It's central in a lot of places around the world. This idea of the sun star. In Ukrainian context, it's the sun star. This is a Mennonite floor tile. Thinking through what it means to inscribe one's architecture, one's floor. I keep returning to the floor in my work. Really kind of spending time and working through the possibilities of the geometries, because it's a set, it's kind of presents you with a set form, and then you can compose out of it, much like an alphabet. This is a series I began that is called Nouvelle Rushnik, and it's a series that takes the parallelogram form of one part of the 8-pointed star sewn into strips, and it then becomes a kind of compositional element. Working also with stone, with found plastic bags from Ukraine, and with images I took, and using applique, pencil crayon applique to draw into the images. Here in this image that you see laying on top of this banner flag type thing is this building here, which I visited through, this is Victor Penner on the right. Victor Penner, rest in power, passed away last month in Zaporizhia, Ukraine, and he was very much a translator and guide for people that were returning to Ukraine, originally from there, and didn't know where to start to look for their family's graves or their village they grew up in, etc. And he's a Russian Mennonite who stayed in Soviet Union, and he was an incredible DIY historian, car mechanic, a wonderful man. And he stopped the car when we were driving one day, and he started pulling weeds away from this foundation of this building. And he said, "These are Russian Mennonite gravestones. These are our gravestones." And I said, "How do you know this? Why are they here, and how do you know this?" And he said, "My father told me." And I said, "How did your father know?" And he says, "Someone told my father." And so understanding that what it means, like what this kind of grafting means, what this represents, this foundation built with this stone, a stone that had marked someone else's death and a monument to that person. It turned out, this is the same building, it turned out a year later that, a few years later, sorry, last year, that this building was excavated and they found hundreds of Russian Mennonite gravestones, and they're working to keep them somewhere and connect them to people, ancestors of those people. I bring this story up. I was in Odessa in November for research, and one building I was looking at for my research, I had spoken to a local man who had a DIY like tile and brick museum in his apartment, which is common in Odessa, that people have their own museums that they run out of their apartment or their yard, and it's really incredible. And he had just told me that they had just discovered Jewish gravestones as a building foundation in the Palace of Culture in Odessa. And they were trying to figure out kind of how to process this as a city to work through what to do with these stones. And these stones existed because the Soviet government in 1965 had completely destroyed a Jewish graveyard and made it into a park. And I went to this park, and people don't walk through this park. It's not used because people know it's a graveyard. But it was an act of state violence against a specific community, thinking through what does it mean in Odessa, a city that already went through the Holocaust and such loss, such mass murder of Jewish and other residents, to think about this transposition and this building material and what to do with it now. And to connect it back to Winnipeg and Manitoba, to think through, I knew that our water came from Shoal Lake, and I knew that the Shoal Lake community had been evicted for that water source, violently evicted, back when the aqueduct was built. But what I didn't know is it had actually been built through a evicted and displaced graveyard. And again, it becomes a very material question of what do we do? What do we do with the aftermath of such state violence? Whether it's the water that we're consuming or it's the foundations of a building of culture, a museum. This is a close-up of that work. Again, spending time with such images, making compositions on the floor. And my friend Nahid pointed out in a studio conversation that by working through this means on the floor, which I was kind of confused about at the time, in a whole room of these, you really have to watch where you're walking, and you really have to focus on the ground, and you have to be quite careful, and you have to make your decision about how you're going to move through the room, much like moving through a ruin or moving through a space that you need to pay attention to the ground. These kind of hyper-regional textiles and patterns, again, point towards the movement towards a national flag, a kind of distillation of culture and peoplehood into these hyper-distilled images and material constructions of nation states, which are fairly new in their current form. I started thinking about the plastic bag as the newest textile in our lives, thinking through, in the Ukrainian context, the images and patterns that are printed on the bags. Here we have cherry, which is the national fruit of Ukraine, with the word luxury underneath. We have the sun with the word boom underneath. We have the BMW symbol, which I'll speak about in a moment. We have this ancient Greek-Italian architectural tile detail. We have the puma. Thinking through this relationship of concrete, stone, and steel, the kind of classic colonial monument being a steel figure, something that can be molded on top of stone, something that has a geological time, is connected to the earth and an ancient time, and trying to kind of take apart these two materials and think through what are their possibilities outside of such solidity. The flagpole seems like an interesting space to shift and bend out of existence. The BMW bag is, so in Ukrainian markets, you usually buy, you either bring your own reusable bags, or you could buy name brand, kind of beautiful name brand, nice plastic bags at the market. And the BMW bag is the most kind of enduring one that I've seen. It's a knockoff, a fake BMW bag that you can purchase for a little bit of extra money. And I was thinking through the BMW symbol itself. The company started in 1917, the Bavarian Motor Works, and they took their symbol from the Bavarian monarchy flag, the national crest of the familial crest of the monarchy in Bavaria. But they weren't allowed to use the shape of actually the parallelogram, and so they shifted it into this circle. And it's a very simplified 1917. It's the early emergence of Bauhaus and constructivism. They simplified it into this beautiful, simple shape with the blue and white, and proceeded to make engines, airplanes, and different kinds of appliances and motors. And BMW is quite interesting because they somehow survived their horrible track record during the Second World War, which was to use concentration camp labor and POW labor to produce weaponry for the Nazi army. They have returned to a status symbol and to this image of wealth and kind of sleek power. And in response to this bag, I created a knockoff of the knockoff, where, if you remember, to the Pizanki symbol we saw earlier of the oak leaf, the stylized oak leaf and the sun star, I've placed it here on this plastic bag with a Low German, with a Plotich text that reads "the thing that holds." And these bags are distributed at museums, galleries, art fairs. They're available at Plugin right now. Free of charge. They usually get handed out with a purchase. So thinking about portable textile, a portable text is perhaps could be like a one-page artist book. And thinking about circulation and multiple lives of a material. I think a lot about my grandmother's practice of collecting, and she would wash and dry and fold bags, and they would always have multiple lives, and we knew where to access the clean new plastic bags, which I think is a common practice for a lot of refugee and immigrant grandparents, at least of her generation. So thinking through, again, a knockoff of a knockoff and this copy. I'll speak briefly about the objects here now in the plugin show. So along with these wall-based works and the large black monochrome wool banner, the bag is being distributed through the plugin bookstore, and a small artist book I wrote last year in dialogue with my Soviet cousins' histories, and with early Soviet constructivism and Soviet conceptualist artist work. I kind of wrote this collage text, which is the artist book you can get at Plugin, or you can download off my website. And here I wanted to deal with these objects that I had been collecting. And I'll start with this painting, which is one of the last objects that came into my possession through my cousins in Germany, who lived most of their lives in exile in Kazakhstan. And my great uncle was born and raised in Crimea and by the Black Sea. And he was exiled quite young, and the only time he could come back was in the 90s. After the Soviet Union had fallen, he went back to Crimea to visit. And the only thing he brought back from his trip was this painting. And this painting is kind of mundane, but quite beautiful. And the thing that struck me about it is this trough, this kind of hardened trough that is formed by the light. And so it has an almost magical feeling to it. And this hung in his living room for 25 years. And he had just taken it down actually before my visit. So I found it in storage and I borrowed it for the exhibition. It makes me think of the work of Archip Kunji, who was a Greek Crimean painter who painted the region where Russian Mennonites are from in Ukraine. His use of light and his use of landscape. The kind of counterpart to this painting is this beautiful mountain wave. It's a postcard from the North Sea, Ostsee in East Germany. And it's this very strange kind of tourist postcard that is a photograph of a wave. There's no other landscape or marker or architecture or thing happening. It's just this wave stuck in this mountain formation, this misty mountain formation. When I was in Odessa in November, I was thinking through limestone, as the whole city is built out of limestone. And there it's a very soft yellow limestone. And the city is actually kind of crumbling because so much of it is built from this limestone, and it needs a protective layer, kind of like adobe bricks. And if the protective layer comes off, then the limestone starts to disintegrate. And as I brought it to Winnipeg and spent time in Winnipeg, I really thought through the use of limestone in Winnipeg as building material, something that is often identified with a kind of Manitoba architectural building material, and thinking through the colonial architectures that use limestone right around Plugin, the legislature building, the Hudson's Bay Company. There's a monument right outside of Plugin. The Human Rights Museum is built out of limestone. And limestone itself is quite a special material because it's essentially made of compressed bone, like sea creature bone. And so it holds strata, it holds fossils, it holds its own making is quite evident in its materiality. And finally, this blanket, which is a factory-made Soviet Kazakh blanket that my family had hanging on their wall in their, essentially they lived in incarceration their entire lives there, so in their kind of mining camp home. And when they emigrated, they used it as a moving blanket, and for the last 20 years, it's been in the trunk of my cousin's car, and it's stained, and it's did a really good job. It's a thick blanket, and I asked to borrow this also for the exhibition, and all the objects in the exhibition have some kind of relationship to glass and wood, some kind of framing device that really fails to protect, or protects intermittently, is overly porous, is overly fragile, and can't really hold the objects it's supposed to hold. A kind of simple gesture of framing or holding or display. And I think we're just about at time. I'll speak briefly about this this banner. This is the front at night, and this is from the back. And here we see, if you look at it in a certain light, you can see the kind of writing and the texture of the slightly raised, debossed text. But with no direct light, the text simply fades into the background. This text really draws on over 500 years of citations from various historical texts. It draws on early radical Anabaptist and Mennonite kind of eschatological radical exclamations or pronunciations during the Reformation, calling for full equality, distribution of wealth. It collages in lines from tracts from the Ukrainian anarchist movement that was fighting for land and liberty and equality, distribution of wealth again, and actually held like a huge part of Eastern Ukraine during the Russian Revolution and Civil War, which has its own history with Russian Mennonites. And Soviet, like a Rodchenko poster, and my own writing. And it kind of blends these temporalities and these times into one kind of poetic, kind of eschatological end times towards the possibility of the future kind of text. And in many ways, this text was, I wrote it in English with some Plotich. Again, I worked with Heinrich Siemens to translate it into Plotich and transliterate it into the Cyrillic alphabet, which is the alphabet that Russian uses. And so the text itself is tainted, textured by my accent in Plotich because I chose the transliteration, and Heinrich corrected me, but I fought back on how I thought the pronunciation should be represented in this alphabet. It holds some really beautiful terminologies that only exist in Plotich, so that there's a word yapsa, yaps or yapsa in the language, which is simply a measurement of how much is held in cupped hands. So like ein yapsa for like a baking flour or something like this. So it's this strange non-standardized measurement because our hands are all different, but it's also the word for your last breath when you die, because it's about the size of a last breath. So it carries these really beautiful kind of language-specific and context-specific nods. And then, of course, it's kind of a banner for an impossible gathering, because the people that could read this banner immediately are Russian Mennonites who did not make it, or who survived exile, but are in such a dispersed diaspora they couldn't be gathered for this particular banner. Even if you could read it immediately, you'd have to struggle through the alphabet. When I showed this work to my cousins, they had such a difficult time, and they were really excited but also frustrated because all of a sudden their two first languages, Russian and Plotich, were pushed together in the same space, and they really had to work to think through what the text was and what it said. And the last line of the poem crossfades into this painting by Sergei Onufriev, who was an unofficial artist in Odessa, a painting he made in 1987 titled How's the Breathing? And it repeats this text. My text ends in how's the breathing, crossfading into his text, how's the breathing, how's the breathing, how's the breathing. And thinking through this painting, I keep returning to this painting, and it's both an extremely interior question. It's an interior painting, an interior poem, something I ask myself regularly. And then it's also a collective question. It's also a question to all. And at this moment, we can't separate it from the calls in protest movements right now. The movement for Black lives and against police violence, state violence, against Black and Brown and Indigenous bodies here and around the world, in thinking about, asking about breath. And so thinking about the ways in which collage and construction function and are kind of constantly brought into renewal and brought into the present through their context. Collage is constantly acknowledging itself as construction. And when you have pieces and some kind of disintegration, and you're working with that disintegration, it constantly offers possibility, as opposed to something solid. Solid things get toppled, and this is what we see happening. An exciting act that's happening all over the world of colonial monuments getting toppled. And when we want to work in a resistant form, for me, I work in this form that has a more dissipated and extended materiality. I could end there, or I could read 5 minutes. Should we stop? Okay. Nazrin, should we move over to the Q&A?
Yes, sorry, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would be happy to move over to the Q&A, but I would also maybe love to hear just a little bit of what you wanted to read, if you like.
Okay, I kind of killed the mood maybe, but I'll try to return to the mood and crossfade, and then it's just 5 minutes of text. This is from the end of the artist book being distributed at Plugin right now, and PDF on my website. And this was written, a lot of my work is written in a lot of ways for my grandparents, for my cousins, for my Tanta Loli, who I'm writing to them in their childhoods, is often something I'm writing about and to. 3, may there always be sunshine. The flag says this motto, like a state greeting card to the child on the event of every sunrise of each year. The epic is always dawning, and we arise to its awakening, follow in its flow. This is like the ghost we are surrounded by, this sunshine is. We are always counting, sometimes faster, more urgently or slow. Counting, counting, counting. We count how much we count, still counting. The scale becomes its volume, its mass. Evidentiary is what they call it, but it is flat. Like pages in an archival volume, the evidence is flat, stored, an irresponsible index to the scale of the thing. So if it is 3 hours, 3 years, 3 shots, or 16, our counting is abstract and we build it and it is ours. The victory implies a war, and so the sun is captured, banished, wrapped in blankets and put to bed. Its 8 points still stand though, and they're still sharp, pointing a red wedge, a black square, a circle of light. Like a halo can be denied when the dancing is circular. These shapes move us and can't be removed. May there always be sunshine in the victory over the sun. May there always be sunshine in the victory under the sun. May there always be sunshine in the victory when it comes. May there always be sunshine, likely for always on this earth. The flag says this motto, like a state greeting card to the child on the event of every sunrise of each year. She woke up to this like a Bible verse she couldn't forget, folded it into her arms and legs as she sunk into the earth with her little feet. May there always be sunshine in the work camp, in the fields, in the mines, in the middle of the night, when you wake in a pain you didn't know could exist. You swallow that sunshine to ease it, beg for darkness and holding, sneak out to the yard to piss just to see the moonlight take over, post-sunshine, post-day, post-painting. You work as a child in a summer camp of constructivist architecture. It is one of many that you will know. When you're 16 and your incarceration ends, you will try to find work in the capital. You'll become a seamstress, a single mother, and live in an apartment on the first floor. You'll take chai in the modernist tea house in Dushanbe. You will enter under its bright pink neon lights, the Remember Tea House, Chaikhana Farokat, where the honey is as strong as the tea leaves, you tell me. Te Abende oder te Tage, es macht nichts. Alles verzählt ist der Tee, es bringt uns zum Reden. It brings us to memory, to thought, Denkbild. Like so many things, and you say, over and over, can you imagine, with a smile on your face? And I know that smile, it needs no translation. It is thick with joy and a deep flooding. A flooding you allow because you cannot stop it and you cannot watch it, so you let it flow, like a waterfall, like the rushing river at the foot of your mountains, those mountains you can trace with your eyes closed. There is a secret, and I don't let on. I'm ready for the knowing. It is about balance, poise, and waiting. I know there is an inside and an outside, the entrance vague but understood. The untethered is the ethos here, tethered only to other untethered, so that the choir's voice is the sail in the ship. It is quiet here, so fucking quiet that I know by theory I should hear my own blood moving through my own veins, but the ringing and din of everything remains in my ears, bouncing through tiny chambers, overwhelmed by their own sound. An announcement is an event, and it could be loud or soft, and we pronounce such things quietly. Which alphabet to use is one choice of many, and the good collectivist speaks legibly, while the bad one mumbles low, like humming. It is the wind and the void that make this place whole, a whole archipelago, a constant flow. The world alongside the world is a magic art, a language art. Every shape that patterned its way through hands, thoughts, into fibers, textured text has taken refuge. Vibrations may dissipate, but they always sound again. Though you don't say as much, I know you as an artist. You live and work in Darmstadt and Dushanbe. Your work is material, idea, archive, and action. Your practice is methodical, practical, poetic, and unknown. Your circulation interior, your exhibitions unmarked, unnamed, covert. Your ongoing series, bags, collects broken umbrellas from the street, the ones made to break, glittering sidewalks after a day of heavy rain. You carefully cut the fabric off the bones, lay triangle next to upside down triangle, and sew them back into squares. You sew in handles and sides, making a thing with which to hold other things, and you distribute these for use. You are not interested in restoration. You are invested in transmutation, bound to movement and dispersal. You read and write transposition into the world, and assemblage is your central tool. You're a translator. You sing to yourself incessantly. You hang bright green curtains of woven plastic in your concrete dacha, where your geraniums still and tomatoes grow. You laugh when I read you Monastirsky's text. The banners hung in the forest. It's a beautiful joke. I get up to heat the kettle and you won't let me, but your knees are so sore. You accept my insistent offer and wagging hand. Smiling, holding your knees, you say, "Aber jo, dat is voor. Es dat kratje zoals alle weven op de welt. Bloos dat je veel hier verstoot je. En hij verstoot uit je veel wijn." That's the end.
Thank you. I'm not actually sure if I'm on screen right now. Thank you so much, Kandis. That was beautiful. Thank you. I'm so glad you read that. I do want to remind our audience that your exhibition, along with Catherine Opie's exhibition, is on until August 22nd. So we have one more week, or a few days, less than a week, until Saturday. And I also, please feel free to send us questions. We will be doing a Q&A in 2 minutes. The email to send questions to is questions@plugin.org, and I'll be happy to take them and let Kandis know. So yeah, we'll be back in just a minute. How are you feeling? First question, how are you?
I'm good.
Thank you so much for that really thoughtful and very, I just felt there was very rich, super connected to your process and to the intricate ways in which you think about your practice. And I'm so happy that you were able to be with us today. I know that it has been not a very easy time. I know you've been moving your studio to Chicago, so I just want to thank you for making the time to be here and to do this. I think my first question, you know, you touched on it at the beginning, and maybe it reads more like a comment. but there has been a lot going on, as you know, since mid-March, and with the global uprisings in support of the Black Lives Matter movement, the devastating explosion in Beirut, so much more, including the continued perpetuation of violence by the police and military toward Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities across the world. So I think it is of extreme importance, and that we continue to pay attention to the philosophies and values and actions and demands of abolition. And I felt, and this might be a stretch, but honestly, I felt that having been with your exhibition along all of this, and having to be in that space every day, there was something to the banner that I felt was actually comforting, was empowering. I felt pulled by its signal, even though you know that I don't understand the language. And even though there is a translation, it is quite poetic. But I felt it really felt active to me in a way that made the space feel like it adhered to the impact of these events, and specifically because it doesn't let us forget about its connection, doesn't let us forget that protest is connected to this type of form or material that ignites language in this way. And whether it's the poem or it's the text that you have threaded in your banner, whether it's just the ways in which we're trying to find words these days that pull us in a certain direction and that lift us up. I felt like the space did that because of the sculpture and because of its connection to the way that you think of your connecting to your history and the diaspora that you're a part of. And I think I'm just making a comment, but I don't know if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, maybe I'll speak briefly. It's really beautiful to hear your reflections on it in some ways in a super formal sense. And I think that form is often kind of depoliticized, and it's extremely, it can be extremely resonant and powerful through material, through form, through color, through shape, through architecture. And I think there's also something to be said for the grammatical tense of the protest banner. And I'm someone who received political education from elders and activists in Winnipeg when I was younger. I painted many protest banners there and here in Montreal. I've been active in political movements for abolition. And it's the grammatical tense of a banner is the future present tense. It's a collective announcement. It's a way of speaking together in public. It's something that masses of bodies are usually around. And in this moment, this was a banner that masses of bodies were not around. And it was maybe not made for masses of bodies to gather under, but it is a kind of monument that offers itself as a wool, like the materiality of the wool itself. We know that we've just been living in a specific kind of emergency. Many people live in constant emergency. And we know that we could use that banner as a bed or as a mattress or as a blanket. We know that it's like its possibility is open to us, I think, on a very formal level, as well as its actual text. And as someone who got to spend a lot of time with it in this iteration, I really appreciate hearing your relation to it in this moment where articulation and collective speech and action and gathering is something I think on so many people's minds, and we're either participating in it or distant from it. And yeah,
absolutely. We are getting some questions in already. Anna Leventhal asks, hi Kandis, can you say a bit more about what it means to be an unacknowledged artist in terms of the family members you spoke about, and what importance or meaning does does that designation hold for you?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. There's a lot of people in my family that make installations and objects and ways of writing, material practices that in the world we live in currently at this moment, in the dominant culture, would get called outsider art or folk art or naive art or craft. And I did my art education a bit older in life than some people. I was 30 when I did my undergrad, and I was 40 when I did my graduate degree. And I'm still kind of, I'm not shocked anymore, but I was very surprised to learn about these institutional designations of, which are quite colonial designations of who's allowed to be an artist and who's allowed to speak in certain ways. So that I was told that Brancusi was not a folk artist, but that the G's Bend collective quilters were. And I don't understand. I still don't understand. I understand where the structures come from, but this is not the way I wish to work, and not the way I wish to experience, make, and understand and see art in the world. And I work in galleries and museums, and I also distribute my work in grocery stores and corner stores. And there's many methods in which I'm interested in circulating my work on a personal level. And so to think through the term unofficial, it's something I've been using because most people in my family identify their work as, their practice, and that it's important and that it's materials that they desire and need to work with. And I think I work from a place, I would identify my practice as coming from the place where need and desire overlap. And I think that is maybe like an interesting definition of folk art also, what's called folk art. That calling them unofficial artists is just a way of kind of acknowledging that the world doesn't acknowledge them, but that they have extremely rich and interesting and experimental practices that, given another context or a different relationship to the power structure that the art world functions in, they might be considered and paid or recognized with some kind of professionalism. And so I don't know, is it a useful term? Maybe it just perpetuates the separation, I don't know. But I find it interesting that a lot of the Soviet artists, in a lot of ways, were not that far from the Soviet system, in the sense that there was like an official way of working, and if you weren't working officially, you were not an artist. But under capitalism and neoliberalism and white supremacy and the structures we function within, if you're not making art in a certain method, then you're not recognized as an official professional artist. So it's like these interesting ways of kind of like resisting what is allowed to be art and how we function. So yeah, I don't know, it's maybe a strange term in some ways. And I'm really liking it as a way to acknowledge practices in my family that wouldn't otherwise be acknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Anna.
Next question is from Nahed Mansour. She's asking, I was wondering if Kandis could speak to her choice of colors in her work, both in the plugin exhibition and her practice more generally. I think I used to work almost exclusively in black and white in a way that surprises me now. And in, for instance, the Nouvelle Rushnik series of these sewn strips that kind of create these banners that I put on the floor and fold in different ways, those are almost always composed. The color palettes almost always correspond, after the fact, I don't think of it consciously, but almost always correspond to Pysanky patterns that I've either seen or that I have at home. So that there's like a way in which our memories filter and hold information that, you know, people call it intuition, but it's the kind of knowledge that we access in different ways. You could call it intuition. And so a lot of the colors really draw on those relationships of color fields. Often I'm using red a lot in a way that maybe relates in an obvious way to a Soviet reference of revolutionary era. And I think a lot of the Soviet artists in the late period that I was kind of touched on also play with these
with these kind of tropes or these standards of red and black and these such things. In the use of the large black monochrome banner, black is a very kind of central color in Russian Mennonite culture. A lot of people only wear black, depending on what your interpretation of living Mennonite is. And it's also a color that a lot of women in my family wear regularly. It wasn't until I kind of was friends with more people from different backgrounds that I realized that maybe it wasn't, maybe it was kind of seen in a specific way, that it was read as a specific kind of like funerary, serious decision, but I don't see it that way. But I have, been making decisions more directly around color, but also drawing on these intuitive palettes that arise really from spending a lot of time looking at Byzanki. It's really like been a central reference for quite a few years.
Thank you. Jonathan Dick asks, can you speak about how the kind of memory you are gesturing toward in your work as disintegrative possibility conflicts with memory as commemorative nostalgia, which preserves? Is it right to see these kinds of memory as a kind of conflict? Do you see this conflict playing out within the Mennonite diaspora?
Hi, Jonathan. Also, hi, Nahed. Thanks for coming. Yeah, this is a really big question. And Jonathan and I have spoken about this before. And it's a really central question. I'm really excited about the writing of Svetlana Boym when she talks specifically about nostalgia. And she kind of separates nostalgia into two fields. Restorative nostalgia in the diaspora, where nostalgia is a desire for something that no longer exists. So if we think about restorative nostalgia, it often leads to a kind of right-wing kind of nationalism of trying to restore something that no longer exists and to make it as it was, as opposed to reflective nostalgia, which is a nostalgia that deals with refraction and fragmentation and reflection, and is very much about living in that world of reflection and refraction, of things not embracing things not being whole, and understanding you cannot return, but finding that terrain interesting. So that's when she speaks about diasporic intimacy and in inhabiting exile and living with doubles and ghosts. And I think that through ideology and structures of power, we make decisions on how we write our narratives, and we make decisions on how we remember our past. So a big question in Russian Mennonite construction of historical narrative is this idea that we were victims and we gained freedom when we came to Canada. It's a huge generalization, but and I think in the context of the history of Manitoba as a colonial construct, we really have to think through what it means to gain freedom through a colonial structure. That's not freedom, that's segregation. And that segregation can be very nuanced and play out in many ways, but that's what that is. And so I think it's, now I've kind of forgot your question, I could go on and on, but thinking through like memory, I'm really interested in structures of memory that embrace disintegration and embrace the status of non-ruinous ruin, something that's falling apart, but it's still necessary and we still value it. And how can we enter into construction with it? How can we graft onto it? How can we have multiple points of entry and textures to the thing? These are, I think, the things that Mennonite history, specifically in a Manitoba context, these are the questions we need to not even just grapple with, we have to address them. And they're material and conceptual and political questions. And we make choices. We come from a very radical place. We come from a place that was demanding, essentially demanding abolition and demanding abolition of wealth, demanding abolition of structural inequality. And not all of us, but the general movement. And many Mennonites still choose to work for abolition, choose to work with and towards restorative justice, and others participate in the war machine and participate in neoliberal right-wing politics. So like any community, we have our choices, and the way I want to work is towards a fragmented and refractive reality that includes the relationship we have to the place that we came to through the colonial project, the way that we were used through the colonial project as prison labor in the Soviet Union. These are not the same structures, but they're structures of power that we have to negotiate through our memory and through our making as artists or writers or historians or just people. Yeah. Thanks for that question. That's a huge one.
You answered it really beautifully. Well, I have a question, maybe also more of a comment. But correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that constructivism is something you have definitely been interested in for a while, but I'm not sure at what point you really came into it as something that that you are curious about, that you also have real connection to in terms of your practice. It always seemed to me that your practice was already constructivist in some way. So I'm wondering if you want to speak to that, if you want to just tell us more a bit about why this particular movement is interesting to you, and how has it had impact on your work and its development through the years.
I think much like I came to learn about these Soviet unofficial artists that were functioning in the late Soviet era, and I realized how much their experience and their way of describing their work reflected people in my family and how they described their work and their experience of exile, whether internal or external exile. I think constructivism is much like that for me. It's a movement I learned about. It's a movement we're all familiar with through visual culture all around us, because it has affected visual culture, particularly in the West, quote unquote, but really worldwide. It's impacted graphic design, also all over Asia. I mean, it's really like a expansive visual shift that happened in visual culture. So I was already familiar with it in those ways. Like, we're always familiar with things that circulate and we can't necessarily name them, but they're there. But I think in some ways there's one kind of tenet, I guess, of constructivist work, which is that your tools and your art objects are your comrade, and that you're working with your art and you're working with your tools. And it's not about individual vision. It is about a kind of collective articulation that is both a necessary tool. It fulfills some kind of need, and is also a kind of articulation into the world. And I would say that in a lot of ways, Russian Mennonite culture holds those kind of values, and definitely my family holds those kind of values around material. My grandmother collecting, washing, drying, and folding and storing plastic bags was not just a practical measure of saving money and reusing something. It was really respecting the material for what it was and what it could do and what it could do again, so that there was like a kind of really deep relationship with material and with future. I would say that most Russian Mennonite and other kinds of Mennonite also relationship to materiality is a deep respect for the material itself and the role it can play as a useful object, but also maybe a decorative or spiritual object. And that, my grandmother was an artist, an unofficial artist. My aunt and my cousin are both practicing artists. My father is an architect and a self-taught Russian Mennonite architectural historian. My mother has a very unique installation experimental writing practice. My uncle was a carpenter. These are all, I grew up around farmers. These are all people who have a deep relationship with material and with repair and with making, that I think when I came across constructivism as a more defined movement or a more defined approach, it resonated with what knowledge I had already been imparted through my family and through my culture, I think, in a lot of ways. And part of the constructivist movement was also this movement called suprematism, which is like an offshoot and not important to get into the details. But that part of it was very much about stripping away, like kind of coming down to like color and form and rhythm and resonance. And so it was actually quite a spiritual movement and broke off from constructivists because it was focused solely on a spiritual relationship to form and color and making. But I don't see those things as separate. But I see that in quilt work. I see that in, so many different art forms that I really drive my work and inspire a resonance for me. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question. Can you talk about the various armatures or wooden supporting structures? Call it a supporting structure. What they serve in the work. For example, you talked about the painting and postcard on its own without the glass and wooden structure holding them. I'm also interested in the positioning of the translation of the text outside the space of the main display, if you can speak on that as well.
Yeah, I should first and foremost, I thanked Theo Sims at the beginning of the talk, but he helped install the work and he built the armatures for the banner, and I wanted to acknowledge that labor. He built them beautifully. He's also an incredible artist, and our conversations really, again, about family and kind of legacy and understanding making and making art in the world was a really beautiful part of the installation. I spoke a little bit about it in the talk, but the supports and display mechanisms for the objects on the wall are kind of broken down pieces of framework, picture frames, museum displays, kind of showing themselves as what they are, being made of wood and glass, and in this context, overprotecting, underprotecting, being too porous, presenting a kind of fragility. With the painting, I don't know if you can see it in the images, but the glass actually falls much below the box. And why is the painting in a box? These were just kind of intuitive design moves, and I finished the design of those works while I was in Winnipeg. I was stranded in Winnipeg for 3 months during the pandemic, which was really a gift to get to spend time in that city for so long. So it was really kind of a decision around, again, kind of a move to talk about how display mechanisms function, how armatures function, making them very present in the work, very self-conscious of what they're doing and being kind of useless, or asking why protection is needed. With the stone, it's just a glass face and the stone is going to disintegrate no matter what. So it leaves the objects vulnerable. In the case of the postcard, way over protected. And another aspect of that is Karen Asher did such an amazing job of the documentation that you can't actually see the reflections in the glass, but all of those works present reflections. So it's actually quite difficult to see the image or the object clearly. And you really have to move your body and position yourself. And it's one of my hugest frustrations in museums is reflective glass. You can get non-reflective glass, but it's very expensive. And so often the sculpture or the work is protected, but you can't see it and you can't really access the image of it or its texture. And I mean, it's kind of a logistical question, but it's not. It really like controls how we spend time and understand the work. So it also, the whole exhibition pushes your body around. You have to walk around it. You have to change your position if you want to see one of the letters on the banner, or if you want to access the full painting, you kind of can't. And that leads to your question about the text on the outside. I often really ask myself whether I want to provide the translation to this text. it's a question I spoke about with Nasreen, and it's a question I have in general. When I read a little bit from my artist book, I read in Plotic and in Russian, and in Tajik and in Plotic, without translation, because this is how people live. We live across languages, we live across contexts, and we don't always get to understand a history or understand a cultural context. We are often on the outskirts. I wanted, again, a visitor to the exhibition to have to search out the translation and to exit the exhibition to access the translations on the outside of the window. On what is that street? Isabella there, or around the corner?
Oh, Memorial?
Memorial, yeah, it changes like 10 times that street. But on Memorial there. And so you have to exit, and then you also have to look at the exhibition from outside and have the text right in front of you on the glass. Again, you're dealing with reflections on the glass. So it's a hard decision. When I've shown it before, I've announced the text vocally, as opposed to having it written anywhere, so that you can only know the text if I'm there to announce it. These are decisions that are, I don't know, they always change.
Mm-hmm. It really connects to what you had mentioned in your talk about having to walk around on the floor, pay attention to the ways in which you move, and how you feel that out, to not step on something or to not, to tread lightly, I guess, around a certain type of seeing, which I appreciate. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering about your work. To me, in some ways also is very much connected to, I want to say, a practice of archiving that I find really fascinating, and not just in connection to how you already mentioned your family history and thinking through the homeland as language, as oral, but also thinking a lot about the ways you bring different aspects of as you mentioned, the ruin, archiving a kind of process that is between, like you said, a ruin and a non-ruin, or between kind of upholding a specific type of moment of it presenting a specific type of memorial, but also in some ways deteriorating and disappearing. And I feel that your work really sits between these two types of relationships to how we see landscape, how we, in your work, and how we kind of get to experience what you bring into the space as photos or postcards or paintings or language on the banner. Seems very archival to me. I'm not sure if that's something you wanted to speak to.
Yeah, it's a really nice question. I mean, what is an archive? I mean, this is a question I think so much about other artists who work with archive and who work with language and who work with a sense of preservation and also deterioration, and how useful it is to embrace deterioration and disintegration at the same time as building and honoring and preserving. And archives are official archives. It's again a term of official and unofficial archive. I grew up in an archive. I grew up in stories being told over and over. I grew up in piles of photographs that my dad took on trips to Ukraine and different parts of the Soviet Union. I grew up in piles of objects my grandmother collected. And where does an archive kind of begin and end? What are the kind of edges of a thing that confine it or define it? And this relationship between structure and scaffolding, really, like the kind of bare bones of what defines something or holds something up, but also scaffolding is also built around something to access the thing, to repair it, or possibly to enter it. So there's this like relationship that I really value. And as I mean, I'm a young artist in the sense I've been making art for around 10 years, and that feels very young to me. And I think about the photographs I've taken, and I've really started to value the archives I've started to create. I think earlier when I was making work in this capacity, I was hesitant about my own voice. Is it important? Is it interesting? Is my perspective interesting? Is it useful? These kind of really self-conscious questions. And now I understand that my perspective is useful and my work is useful for ways of looking and seeing and understanding and collaging. And also on a very practical level, I mean, I have photographs of places, the Lenin Monument in my grandfather's hometown. I did a whole series of videoscapes, like a tableau vivant of Lenin Monument bases with the Lenins removed and the bases still present. That's a very specific moment in time that will change and has already changed in the context of Ukraine. Taking photos of places that, I mean, some people live, obviously, but very few people photograph or circulate photographs of, so that I understand that my work can function and be useful in many different ways. And I don't love the system I have for my archive of photographs and video and interviews and conversations, but one mode I try to, like a method I try to use to deal with that is to pull things into my work, so that I have one video piece that's a 20-minute text collage, and it is conversations over a month-long trip in Ukraine and producing this one video installation. And in a sense, that video, it doesn't capture everything, but it captures really important moments with all these conversations that happened in that time in relationship to a kind of focused conversation. So the more we can pull fragments in and they're active and they're circulating, it's not so important to have every single photograph or every single moment recorded, which is something that all filmmakers and all people who work with found footage really struggle with. It's an obsessive kind of horrible affliction that's also quite beautiful.
Which is funny because we have another question. I feel like it relates to what you're saying, and I feel like I know the answer to this. Have you made any sound exclusive works given you mention orality as quote unquote home?
Yeah, I started with the beginning of my art practice. I was making sound works, and I went to sound school on like a technical sound recording, mixing, sound design degree in college, like a one-year certificate kind of thing. And the time that I knew I wanted to go to art school was my first time visiting Ukraine and only doing audio recordings and then making these audio collages. And I worked in audio for several years. Again, kind of found or recorded footage. And I did do some oral-based work around using the Plotiche language and using song, actually. I think that growing up in choirs since I was a baby, I don't know if it's changed in Russian Mennonite culture in Winnipeg, in the church I went to now, but when I was a kid, I mean, you started singing the second you could start singing, and I can't remember not being in a choir. And that sense, the architecture that's built through collective singing is an experience I miss deeply. I keep meaning to join a choir to return to that feeling. And I think that all of my work is imbued with some sense of rhythm and a sense of verse, a chorus and verse. There's a lot of like returning to like a kind of main thematic or variations on a theme. I think of my work through instrumentation, through frequency tone. I mean, all of my work to me is kind of sound. In my mind, I don't differentiate between a lot of materials, and things shift from material to material. But I have returned to, I also make soundtracks for my films using either playing instruments and recording or using found footage, found recordings. But I'm returning now to orality in my studio practice. I've started singing again, just on a very like personal life level. I was a musician and a DJ for many years, and I haven't had that in my life for a long time. And the project I'm working in Odessa is the building you saw, that's the archive with those huge buttresses holding up the walls. That was actually built as a choral synagogue. It was built as a space for worship, but also performance and for sound and for voice. And the project I'm working on in Odessa is a response to this, this building and its many lives, and how it's been occupied and used, and how it's been muted. And it had a pipe organ at one point that was stolen by the retreating Nazi army. It's never been found again. This pipe organ is missing. So part of the work I'm making is grounded in limestone, is grounded in the lost orality and the muted orality of this building, and a series around resonant architectures, and will include music and performance and sound. And I continue to practice my plotich, which is a super slow process.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that. How are you feeling, Kandis? I feel like I think that's a really good note to end on.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like you gave us so much to think about. You gave us so much generally. Beautiful artist talk, really beautiful reading. Thank you for answering those questions so eloquently. Yeah, I want to remind everyone again that you have until Saturday to see the exhibition if you're in Winnipeg. All our protocols and procedures are on our website at plugin.org. And I also want to thank Colby Richardson, who is our behind the scenes online streaming person, and Erin Josephson Laidlaw, who also was super helpful in making this happen tonight. And I want to thank Luther and Allison as well, who were here helping tonight too. And thank you again, Kandis. Thank you so much for all of that and for your work. And so glad we were able to do this.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to everyone at Plugin.